Old estate garden records describe potted plants kept by the same doorway for so many winters that nobody could say for certain how old they actually were. Plants that should have frozen out years earlier by every rule of the climate they were grown in, and somehow did not. Most container perennials die within a winter or two. A small number, in the right pot, in the right spot, seem to defy the odds entirely. 9 of them are what this video is actually about. You are about to get 9 perennials proven to reliably return in containers year after year, along with the old estate tradition of the sheltered corner that first identified them, long before hardiness zone science existed to explain why they worked. You will also get the specific pot size, sunlight, and winter protection details for each one, and the one question about all of this that still does not have a settled answer. A perennial in a pot is far more exposed to winter cold than the same species planted directly in the ground. A container's root zone can swing 10 to 20 degrees colder than surrounding garden soil because there is no surrounding earth mass to buffer it. That is exactly why a plant labeled hardy for your zone on the little plastic tag can still die in a pot on your patio the very first winter. Choosing the right species and giving it the right winter protection is what actually decides whether a container perennial comes back in spring. Long before anyone understood root zone exposure or hardiness ratings, estate gardeners and early American households already knew which specific plants could survive it. Through decades of the same pots, returned to the same corner, year after year. Before the list begins, here is the container size reference for all 9 plants, worth having ready as we go. Lavender needs at least a 12-inch pot, wide rather than deep. Hostas need at least 16 inches across and just as deep, since their root systems spread. Coral bells are comfortable in a 10-inch pot. Daylilies want at least 14 inches. Coneflowers need 16 inches for their taproot. Black-eyed Susan is happy in a 12-inch pot. Sedum only needs 8 to 10 inches. Catmint wants 12 inches with room to spread. Yarrow is content in 10 inches. Keep those numbers in mind as we go through each one. Plant number 1, lavender. There is an old thread running through European estate gardens describing lavender pots kept by kitchen doors for generations. Plants nobody remembered planting, treated less like a garden chore and more like a fixture of the household itself. Lavender genuinely earns this reputation. It has a woody, drought-tolerant root system that resents wet feet far more than it fears cold, which means the plants that survive are usually the ones that were never overwatered in the first place, not simply the ones protected from frost. Lavender is hardy in USDA zones 5 through 9 in the ground, but container exposure effectively shifts that down by a full zone, sometimes 2 in an exposed pot. If you are in zone 5 or 6, treat your potted lavender like it belongs in zone 4 when winter planting begins. Use a 12-inch pot at minimum, and choose unglazed terracotta if you can. Unglazed clay breathes and wicks moisture away from the roots, which matters enormously for a plant this sensitive to soggy soil. Full sun is non-negotiable, at least 6 hours a day, and lavender will sulk visibly in anything less. Drainage is the entire game with lavender. Use a fast-draining mix. Something built for cactus or succulents works well, amended with coarse sand or perlite. Standing water around lavender roots in winter is a death sentence faster than the cold itself. To prepare it for winter, move the pot against a south-facing wall if you have one, where reflected heat and wind protection do the most good. In zones 5 and colder, wrap the pot itself in burlap or bubble wrap, since an exposed container freezes the root ball far faster than ground soil would. In spring, expect new gray-green growth low on the woody stems before anything happens up top. Do not mistake bare upper branches for a dead plant. Cut those back once new growth appears at the base. The most common mistake is treating lavender like a typical potted flower, watering it on a regular schedule regardless of rainfall. Lavender wants to dry out completely between waterings, and a plant kept damp through a cold winter rarely survives, even in a mild zone. The pot that would not die tradition mentions lavender more than almost any other plant, and one detail keeps repeating that has nothing to do with drainage or sun exposure at all. That detail is still coming. Plant number 2, hostas. Old household garden records describe hosta clumps in containers that were divided and redivided for decades, passed between neighbors, moved from one household's doorway to another's, the plant itself treated as something closer to an inheritance than a purchase. Hostas earn this reputation through an unusually tough underground crown. The visible leaves die back completely every fall, which looks like the plant has died, but the crown beneath the soil holds enormous cold tolerance as long as it does not freeze solid and thaw repeatedly, which is the actual threat in a container rather than straightforward cold. Hostas are rated hardy in zones 3 through 9 in the ground. In a container, treat that rating as one full zone less reliable, particularly in a thin-walled pot that offers little insulation around the crown. Use a container at least 16 inches wide and equally deep, since hosta root systems are wider than most gardeners expect. A thick walled glazed ceramic or a wood planter insulates the crown better than thin plastic or terracotta, which matters more here than with lavender, since hostas need moisture retention rather than aggressive drainage. Hostas want part shade to full shade, making them one of the few reliable perennial choices for a container that only gets morning light or filtered sun on a covered patio. Soil should be rich and moisture retentive, amended with compost, while still draining well enough that the crown is not sitting in standing water through winter rain or snowmelt. For winter, the single most effective step is simply burying the entire pot in the ground up to its rim, if you have any bed space at all, which uses the surrounding earth as insulation the container itself cannot provide. Without that option, group the pot tightly against other containers and a wall, and mulch heavily over the soil surface. In spring, expect nothing visible for weeks after other plants have already leafed out. Hostas are famously slow to emerge, and pointed shoots pushing through the soil, sometimes called hosta noses, are the first real sign of life. Many gardeners give up on a hosta and discard it before this happens. The most common mistake is exactly that, assuming a hosta is dead in April because nothing is showing yet, and tossing a perfectly alive crown in the compost bin 2 or 3 weeks too early. Drop a comment right now and tell me your USDA zone and whether you are growing on a balcony, a patio, or a porch. I read every comment, and I want to know what kind of container setup you are working with before we go further into the list. Plant number 3, Heuchera, coral bells. Estate garden accounts describe coral bells kept in shallow stone troughs near entryways, valued as much for surviving winter as for their color. What made them reliable was never fully written down in those old accounts, only that they were. The real reason is a genuinely cold, tolerant, shallow root system that handles the freeze-thaw cycle of a container better than most perennials its size, provided that crown stays just at soil level rather than heaving upward. Coral bells are hardy in zones 4 through 9, shifting to roughly zone 5 reliability in a pot. A 10-inch container is enough, since the root system stays compact. Part shade suits them best, with some afternoon shelter from harsh sun. Use a well-draining mix, and avoid burying the crown too deep when planting. For winter, mulch 2 to 3 inches over the soil surface, and group the pot with others for shared insulation. In spring, expect new leaf rosettes to emerge directly from the visible crown, often faster than most perennials on this list. The most common mistake is planting the crown below the soil line, which invites rot long before winter cold ever becomes the real threat. Coral bells explain one piece of the reliability question completely: root cold tolerance. Most gardeners never learn to check. It does not explain why certain individual pots, tracked in old estate records, outlasted every other pot of the exact same plant nearby. That detail is still coming. If you have ever checked a container in early spring and found nothing but bare, frozen soil where a perennial used to be, you already know exactly the feeling this whole list is built to prevent. That empty pot moment is avoidable more often than most beginner gardeners realize, and it almost always comes down to one of three things: the wrong species, the wrong pot, or the wrong winter placement, not simply a hard winter that could not have been survived. Plant number 4, daylilies. Daylilies show up again and again in old homestead records, specifically because they were passed hand to hand between households for generations, divided and given away so often that the original source of a given clump was often long forgotten. Their reliability comes from a thick, fibrous root system built to store energy through dormancy, tolerant of far rougher treatment than most flowering perennials, including the kind of freeze-thaw cycling a container produces. Daylilies are hardy in zones 3 through 9, shifting down roughly one zone in a container. Use a 14-inch pot at minimum, since the root mass expands quickly. Full sun to part sun works well, and daylilies tolerate more inconsistency in light than most plants on this list. Soil should be ordinary and well-draining, with no special amendment required. For winter, a sheltered corner and a few inches of mulch over the crown is usually enough, even in Zone 4 with a reasonably insulated pot. In spring, expect strappy green shoots pushing straight up from the crown, often among the earliest signs of life in the whole container garden. The most common mistake is choosing too small a pot initially, then being surprised when a daylily becomes root-bound and stops flowering within 2 seasons, long before winter ever becomes the issue. Plant number 5, coneflowers, Echinacea. Old prairie homestead accounts describe coneflowers kept in large stone urns near farmhouse entrances, admired for surviving winters that killed nearly everything else planted alongside them in the same exposed spot. What made them survive is a genuinely deep, drought-adapted taproot evolved on the open prairie to handle extreme temperature swings, which translates surprisingly well to the exposure of a container, provided the pot is deep enough for that taproot to actually develop. Coneflowers are hardy in zones 3 through 9, and container exposure shifts that down about one zone, less severe than some other plants here because of how tough the root itself is by nature. Use a 16-inch pot, prioritizing depth over width, since a shallow pot cramps the taproot and weakens the plant's natural resilience. Full sun is essential, at least 6 hours daily, and coneflowers grown in too much shade become leggy and more winter vulnerable, regardless of pot size. Soil should be lean and well-draining, closer to prairie conditions than rich garden soil, since overly fertile, moisture-retentive soil actually reduces their cold hardiness. For winter, leave the dried seed heads standing, rather than cutting them back in fall. They provide the plant a small amount of natural insulation and offer food for birds through the coldest months. Move the pot to a sheltered spot and mulch lightly. In spring, expect low basal foliage to appear before any sign of the tall flowering stems, often later than gardeners expect from a plant this hardy. The most common mistake is cutting coneflowers back hard in fall for tidiness, removing the very insulation the plant benefits from and exposing the crown to open winter air unnecessarily. Has anyone watching already lost a perennial in a pot that was supposed to be hardy for their zone? Tell me in the comments which plant it was and what happened. Real gardener experience in the comments is some of the most useful data on which of these plants actually hold up in containers, not just in the ground. If you have still been watching and Garden Every Day is not yet in your subscription list, understand what that actually means. YouTube tracks the channels you follow and prioritizes your content in your feed. The moment you leave this video without subscribing, the algorithm begins deciding whether to show you the next one, and it does not always decide in your favor. Beginner-friendly, zone-specific container growing guides go out from this channel every single week. Hit subscribe. It will not take you nearly as long as it took you to read that sentence. Plant number 6. Black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia. Homestead journals mention black-eyed Susan almost in passing, treated as too common and too tough to be worth much comment, which is itself part of why it belongs on this list. A plant nobody worried about is often the plant quietly doing the best job. Its reliability comes from vigorous self-seeding combined with a genuinely hardy crown, meaning even a rough winter that damages the main plant often still produces new growth from seed the following spring, a kind of built-in backup plan few other perennials offer. Black-eyed Susan is hardy in zones 3 through 9, container exposure shifting that down about 1 zone. A 12-inch pot is sufficient. Full sun to part sun suits it well, and ordinary well-draining soil is all it needs, with no special amendment required. For winter, a sheltered spot and light mulch is usually enough, and this is one of the more forgiving plants on the list if you miss a winter protection step here or there. In spring, expect fuzzy basil leaves low to the soil well before any flowering stems appear, and sometimes new seedlings sprouting nearby in the same pot. The most common mistake is deadheading too aggressively in fall, removing the seed heads that would otherwise produce next year's backup seedlings. That empty pot feeling deserves one more honest moment before the list continues. It is rarely one single mistake that causes it. It is usually the wrong plant, in a pot slightly too small, placed somewhere slightly too exposed, 3 small choices stacking together into one disappointing spring. Every plant remaining on this list exists specifically to remove that stacking effect, one clear choice at a time. And for reference, spring regrowth timing varies more than most beginners expect. Lavender and coral bells show life within the first warm week. Hostas and coneflowers can take 3 to 4 weeks longer than everything else in the same container garden, so patience matters as much as technique. Plant number 7. Sedum. Old estate accounts describe sedum almost the way they describe stone itself, unbothered by neglect, unbothered by weather, present in the same shallow dish for so many seasons that gardeners stopped thinking of it as something that could die at all. The real explanation is succulent leaf tissue that stores water efficiently and a shallow but remarkably cold hardy root system, which together make sedum one of the most drought and cold-tolerant perennials available for containers of any size. Sedum is hardy in zones 3 through 9, and container exposure barely shifts that rating, making it one of the most forgiving plants on this entire list. An 8 to 10-inch pot is plenty. Full sun works best, though sedum tolerates part sun without much complaint. Soil must drain fast. A cactus or succulent mix is ideal, since sedum's real vulnerability is rot, not cold. For winter, minimal protection is needed beyond keeping the pot somewhere it will not sit in standing water or snowmelt. In spring, expect fleshy new growth directly from existing stems, often visible earlier than almost anything else in the container garden. The most common mistake is planting sedum in rich, moisture-retentive soil meant for flowering annuals, which invites rot long before any winter cold becomes relevant. Sedum solves the drainage half of the puzzle completely. It does not solve why the sheltered corner tradition specifically insisted on the same corner every single year, not just any sheltered spot nearby. The next plant gets closer to that answer, or closer to why the answer is not quite as complete as it sounds. Which of these 9 surprised you most so far? Drop the number in the comments. And be honest, how many of you assumed a plant labeled hardy for your zone would automatically survive in a pot? Most people assume that. It is one of the most common reasons container perennials do not come back. Plant number 8, Catmint. Old cottage garden records list catmint alongside lavender as a doorway staple, planted for scent as much as reliability, and it earned a similar reputation for outlasting winters that took everything planted near it. Catmint's hardiness comes from a similar mechanism to lavender, a woody, drought-adapted base that dislikes wet winter soil far more than it dislikes cold itself, which means winter survival here is mostly a drainage question in disguise. Catmint is hardy in zones 3 through 9, shifting down about 1 zone in a container. Use a 12-inch pot with room for its spreading habit. Full sun suits it best, and it tolerates part sun with slightly less vigorous blooming. Soil should be lean and fast draining, similar to lavender's needs, avoiding rich, moisture-heavy mixes. For winter, a sheltered spot is enough in most zones, with light mulch added in colder regions. In spring, expect gray-green new growth low on the woody stems, similar in pattern to lavender, appearing before the plant looks fully alive from a distance. The most common mistake is cutting catmint all the way to the soil line in fall, which removes protective structure the crown benefits from through the coldest months. Plant number 9, Yarrow. Yarrow appears in old household garden records more often as a medicinal plant than an ornamental one, but the same households that grew it for its leaves also noticed, almost as an aside, that it never seemed to actually die in its pot by the door. Its reliability comes from a fibrous, cold-hardy root system combined with genuine drought tolerance, a combination that handles the freeze-thaw instability of a container about as well as any perennial on this list. Yarrow is hardy in zones 3 through 9, container exposure shifting that down only slightly, similar to sedum in its forgiving margin. A 10-inch pot is enough. Full sun works best, and lean, well-draining soil suits it far better than rich garden soil. For winter, a sheltered spot with light mulch is sufficient in most zones. In spring, expect ferny, feathery foliage low to the soil, often one of the earliest plants on this list to show visible life. The most common mistake is overwatering yarrow through summer out of habit, which weakens the root system heading into winter, even though the plant looks perfectly healthy above the soil line. Before the resolution, here is the full winter protection summary for all 9 plants, worth pausing to write down. Sedum and yarrow need almost nothing beyond a dry, sheltered spot. Coral bells, daylilies, black-eyed Susan, and catmint need a sheltered corner and light mulch. Lavender needs a sheltered spot, mulch, and pot wrapping in colder zones. Hostas benefit most from burying the pot itself or heavy grouping and mulch. Coneflowers want their seed heads left standing through winter as natural insulation rather than cut back in fall. Modern horticultural science explains most of what old estate and household records described as the pot that would not die. The specific cold-tolerant root systems, the thermal mass buffering of a sheltered wall, and the gap between a hardiness rating and real container survival are all explicable through contemporary horticultural understanding. None of that part is genuinely mysterious anymore. Here is what still is not fully explained. Old estate and household garden records repeatedly describe the exact same container being returned to the exact same sheltered spot every single winter, not simply any sheltered corner nearby, as though the specific location itself mattered beyond thermal mass alone. Current understanding of container overwintering does not fully account for that specific consistency. Some garden historians believe this was likely a practical habit, the easiest spot simply reused out of convenience once it had worked the first time. Others point out how consistently this exact detail appears across households and estates, with no connection to one another, which is harder to fully dismiss as coincidence alone. So here is where this actually leaves us. The plants that survive in your containers this winter will do so because of species, pot, and placement, exactly as covered in this list, wrapped in a small piece of old garden habit that still has not been fully explained by anyone measuring it. Do you believe a container perennial's reliable return every spring comes down entirely to species selection, container choice, and winter protection, all fully explainable and covered in this video? Or do you believe the old insistence on the exact same spot, year after year, points to something about container microclimates that current science has not fully mapped yet? Real gardeners and real horticultural historians land on both sides of this, and there is no settled answer. The comment section on this video stays active for months, because this is a debate gardeners genuinely find worth having. Your own container perennial results, this season and next, are the most useful data point in that ongoing conversation. Before you go, one quick reminder: hardiness zone, container size, and winter protection all affect whether a potted perennial survives. Skipping any one of those three is usually the real reason a supposedly hardy plant does not come back, more often than a winter simply being too harsh to survive. If this list changed how you think about container perennials, hit like before you go. Subscribe to Smart Garden for a free, zone-specific growing guide every single week. Share this with any gardener you know who has lost a perennial in a pot and never understood why. And check the next video for a complete 4-season container garden built entirely from reliably hardy perennials like these 9. The pot that would not die was cold-tolerant roots, thermal mass, and the right species chosen long before anyone had a name for hardiness zones. All of that is settled. Why the exact same corner every single year still shows up across garden records that never spoke to each other is not. Tell me what you think it means.